Before my MS diagnosis, I felt like the world was my oyster. I left school in year 12. I had like my university entrance, and my university aspirations were kind of like, I was like, oh, I'll go when I'm around 30 or something. I wanted to travel and maybe teach yoga and teach tennis overseas and just kind of like work on my art and work on my craft. So when I first got my MS diagnosis, it was really intense for me. It was really intense for my family. None of us knew anything about it. I didn't know anything about it. But once I started to learn a bit, I started to, empower my family, kind of teach them the knowledge that I had, and be like, hey, look, like we have tools to work with. But when I navigated the world around me, when I was talking to my friends around it, I realized like they had a different perception of MS. They would say like, oh, I know my friend's grandma who has MS, or oh, I have a friend's mum who has MS, and the ideas of the way it looked and the way it seemed for their futures were really different to what mine is now and what I thought my future was going to look like. So it was really hard for me to come to terms with that, and I found myself, even now to this day, I find myself constantly educating people around me on what MS is, what MS can be, and how different that is to what MS used to be. So I had to make a lot of changes to my career plans since my MS diagnosis, and just like my ambitions changed. I think I kind of gained tunnel vision into having a sustainable future, because a lot of the ideas I had for myself, I really wanted to go into engineering, maybe do something with my hands. I really like art. I love drawing. And I kind of realized that I want to have a job that I can do in 30 to 40 years and still be able to have my livelihood, be able to support myself. And yeah, I guess I became really future oriented, and everything became about equity for me. Was that if I was going to do the same things that I wanted to do earlier, they were going to look different, and the path to those goals was going to be different now. I've had quite a few times where I've thought that I couldn't reach my goals, or that I couldn't overcome something because of my MS, especially when I was first diagnosed. I think one of the biggest times was when I was first diagnosed around my 18th birthday, and I felt like I was going to have to, improvise, overcome, adapt in order to meet the same goals that I had earlier, which is kind of what I spent the year doing after I was first diagnosed. I took a whole year just to myself to kind of rehash my plans, to focus on my health, to hone in on what how I lived, and bettering my mental health, my self-image, and focusing on my future a little bit more than I was earlier. MS has influenced my perspective on my decisions quite heavily. I think I've become quite a goal-oriented person. I've increased predictability in my life. I plan a lot more than I used to, because I know that if I want to do the same things that I did earlier, I have to plan in advance. I have to, take out the confounding factors, and I have to plan for success. So my first relapse was really intense. I usually describe it to a layman as I looked like I drank a whole bottle of wine. I couldn't see out of one eye. Half my body was absolutely paralyzed. I couldn't eat properly. I couldn't speak properly. That was a really harrowing experience. And after I recovered from that relapse, I was left with a few symptoms that I still live with day to day. And usually that involves tingling in my fingertips, a bit of a burning sensation on the surface of my legs and my arms and things like that. I often don't have very good feeling in my feet, so I'm always wearing slippers or socks everywhere I go. And if I'm not wearing them, I often feel like I'm stepping into a void, if I'm not looking at where I'm going. My proprioception's quite impacted. And fatigue is probably one of the biggest ones. I find myself really drained, and I've now had MS for 8 years, and as the years have progressed, I've definitely found myself, I've had my memory a little bit impacted, and my information processing is not what it used to be, but I've always found workarounds because I make my life equitable. I found good ways to memorize things and good ways to stay on top of it. In my early days getting diagnosed with MS, everything felt quite jumbled actually. It was really hard for me to come to terms with it. Nobody in my family has MS. There's no neurological conditions in my family. I found that I spent a lot of time just learning and taking information in. I found that I had to really be tolerant of my family because I know they love me, but it was really hard to be wrapped in cotton wool all the time. And, I needed to explore my own boundaries. So I feel like that first year was all about just exploring my boundaries, seeing what I could do, seeing what I couldn't do, and then working with that to create a plan for how I was going to move forward. So when I was first diagnosed with MS, it changed a lot of things for me. My future ended up looking really different. I think the first thing I thought was, what am I going to do with my life now? Because everything I had planned for my future depended on my body and how I use my body and what my body can do, not what it can't do, which is what I started focusing on very intensely for the next year after that. And I found myself absolutely enveloped by what I couldn't do, not what I can do. So I think that perspective change needed to happen, but I had to mourn my old body. I mourned the loss of, who I was before I got MS, and now I've recreated myself around different measures of like worth and how I want to measure myself these days. One of the most meaningful experiences I've had since getting diagnosed with MS has been working with MS Auckland. I've found that not just for me, but for my family, my mum's been really involved. I've met a lot of friends and it's given me exposure. I think MS Auckland has been a really huge, consistent support for me since my diagnosis. Since day one, they've been really involved. Knowledge is power. Anyone can have MS.